And trust me, it is not for public, for viewing at all. Look, I'm going to start with a very important statement. Measurement without purpose is futile. So hence, you get me majorly excited about the global goals, because for probably the first time I feel across the globe, we actually have a platform of some very clear purpose. I have spent my life working on two sides of this wonderful world, predominantly born here in Australia, but obviously spent a lot of time in the UK for my working and career life, even Stephen almost. And as a result of that, I have come to sort of recognise that if we really are going to enable social change, we have got to embed what we do as purpose. So what I'm going to do in the discussion that we have today and sharing the story of GoodSave with you, and I will actually make a point, I do tend to use the word hashtag because I actually have almost 15 great nieces and nephews, and I've got to somehow move from the hashtag analogy that was given at the beginning of today about the Kentucky tour in the 80s, because I get that, unfortunately, to the hashtag of today and what that means. But it's really just a way of trying to communicate of a case study of how, particularly in Australia, we have actually not only shown how you can demonstrate purpose, but more importantly, break some of the myths that follows these. And this is about this slide here. There's something missing on this slide, and it's called Australia. Now, I find this really frustrating because we're sitting at 11th out of the 34 countries. Okay, we exist in the top 5 in 7 of the indicators, but in 11 of them we're in the bottom third, and that is not good enough. I take responsibility for everything I do to be a part of trying to resolve that. So in my role as CEO of a not-for-profit, which from 2007 to 2015, I had the joy of leading an organisation called Good Beginnings Australia. Now, Good Beginnings is a pretty easy vision to understand because it's giving children a very good beginning in life. Something you aren't going to debate and really good to keep all your energy involved with. But there was one problem for me in Australia. 600,000 other not-for-profits, many of a crowded space in the children's arena, far too much duplication, and we have a moral obligation to not be exploiting our clients and trying to grow businesses on their behalf, but to be really resolving what the issues are. So if you're truly going to be working for purpose, that becomes your moral obligation, not growing the organisation. So I want to share with you how I believe the case study of GoodSave demonstrates how you can work for purpose and break 3 myths of what sits behind the Sustainability Development Goals. I was recently in the UK and I had the opportunity to work alongside some colleagues who actually come from Finland, which sits at number 4. I'm not competitive by any chance here. I might sound it a bit, Honestly, my knitting sort of describes me. It's very, very quiet. But they're number 4. So what are they doing that we're not doing here in Australia? Well, from talking with them, I identified 3 myths that they also have. Things that you hear when you talk about Sustainability Development Goals, and I talk about them a lot. One is, this is just for international pictures. It's really for developing countries. It's not necessarily for the domestic front. The second one is, the goals are far too aspirational, too big, too audacious. They're not tangible enough. How can we, as a very small organisation, or me as an individual, actually affect world hunger? How can I do that? And the third one is, we've already got our measurement frameworks. We've already got them. And if you want to put that into the Australian context, we have a myriad of unconnected frameworks. So we actually don't even have an overarching one to even point to say that we have an overarching framework. So it's very, very fragmented. So I'm going to, I hope, in the very short time that I have with you today, share a case study, which is an Australian one, which shows how it broke through those 3 myths. And it all begins with ducks, okay? Now, looking at the age of the audience, some of us are going to know this, some of us aren't. Bit of a show of hands. Coronation Street. Okay, that's not bad. That's not bad. A bit like the neighbours version of Australia, okay, in the UK. A bit like that. Should never have stayed, but it's been there for a very long time. Now, Coronation Street had a really famous lounge room or dining room setting in it, and it had these 3 ducks that would go up the wall. Some of you may have seen the 3 ducks in your grandparents' home or in pictures in history books, in museums. Who knows, you may have seen them. But they tended to actually be a bit of a hit in the 70s. Everyone, many people, particularly in the UK and in Australia, had these ducks in their home. The reason I'm talking about ducks when I'm at a global goals conference and I'm talking about an Australian case study is because in Good Beginnings, we didn't adopt the ducks of Coronation Street. We adopted these ducks. I'll explain the differences. One is very predictive. It's like a direction, like a map. And those 3 ducks of the Coronation Street stage are going in a very clear diagonal line, and they're following each other in that line. The ducks here, you can see the first one. They get a bit fuzzy after that, don't they? I think that's actually a drink song, Fuzzy Ducks, but we won't go there. But they actually get a little bit distant and not quite sure. You know they're ducks, but you're not quite sure, which is more of an emergent kind of picture. You're very clear of the end point, but you don't necessarily have the route or the map of how you're going to get there. That's more like a compass. And so if I think about Good Beginnings dialogue, when we had that realisation, we're just one of too many not-for-profits in this space. We need to have a moral obligation of how we are going to serve our children and families the best. Maybe we need to get ourselves out of the way, look at the outcome and the purpose, and find a better governance model to do that. We took on board what we called an emergent strategy, which meant that we accepted that we were going to give every child in Australia a good beginning, but the governance model may not be what we currently knew, and it meant that I might not be the CEO, and it meant that the board may not be the board, and it meant that we had to get out of the picture to see what was around the corner. Total disruption, incredibly important, and I stand here today having merged our organisation with another organisation called Save the Children Australia. Now, the Good Save model is all about the preparation that happened in our organisation in leading up to the 1st of July of 2015, because the discussions and the dialogues that had to go on across the whole organisation, with even a named strategy, which we called a mobilising strategy during that duck period, it was really important to get that dialogue happening at all levels of the organisation. So if I take that back to the myth, the very first myth of the global goals, which talks about, it's just for international development approaches, it's not necessarily for domestic. Well, yes, it is. And if we don't include in our dialogues the whole people dialogue, we don't move anywhere. We stay with that predictive strategy, and we will just be like moving the cars around the car park rather than finding out what's causing the traffic jam. So I give you the very small case study of Good Beginnings and the Good Save as how we, in just one organisation, could move out of the way, grow our outcomes rather than grow the organisation, and every single other organisation can do the same. How does that look? And I'm going to dive a little bit deeper. With the Good Save approach, there were 2 steps within it. The very first one is R4O. I like my codes. It stands for Ready for Outcomes. And we couldn't have had that discussion at the board level about, hang on, I may not be CEO, you may not be board, had we not already in the organisation had a very clear understanding of what our purpose was. How were we fulfilling particular outcomes across the country? Now, in 2007, when I took on board all our Good Beginnings, we didn't have that structure. We were very much so a typical pink and fluffy, not-for-profit that just did good. Good was in our name. We did good. And that is very atypical of many not-for-profits around Australia and the world as well. Being accountable it can be a real language that people feel uncomfortable with, but it doesn't have to be that way. Being very clear to your outcomes, being able to explain what you do and make decisions about the programs or whatever you deliver based on that is imperative. If I go to the myth about, well, hold on a minute, they're too audacious. If you don't have the purpose and the end point in mind, how can you work back towards the most day-to-day action that you do? They don't line up if you don't have the end point. In Australia, we do not, and I made this point earlier, we don't actually have an overarching outcomes framework. Very typical OECD country would have one. For whatever reason, we don't have it. Doesn't mean we can't, because we have it all around the room here at the moment. We can adopt these. At the time, we didn't have the SDGs in 2007 because it was the Millennium Goals were still in place. And at that point in time, I aligned Good Beginnings to the United Nations child-friendly cities because that was the only language that I could draw down for Australia at that point in time. And it worked for us because we made sure across the whole organisation, all of the reporting we did aligned to those. So that's the next nugget I'd like to leave with you. If you are going to truly ensure that your measurement has purpose, make sure that you actually align it the whole way through. And you, whatever you do, whoever organisations you're linked with, and some of you I know will still be in a studying stage, and you're looking for what organisation you work with, but as soon as you start working somewhere, that's the kind of questions you must start asking and the way you must start thinking. Because that's how our wonderful little 8-year-old today will need to take the world forward in her work life. So having a look at being ready for outcomes moves me into the next part of the Good Save case study, which is R2C, standing for Ready to Collaborate. You can't get to collaboration stage if you haven't got purpose, outcomes, reporting. How can you collaborate if you can't talk about what you're doing? It just doesn't stack up. And if you try to collaborate without having that lined up, you will have unsuccess. Well, you won't be success. And you'll hear a lot of stories that some of you have heard about not-for-profits trying to merge or trying to link together, and it just doesn't happen. Or organisations trying to work collaboratively, it just doesn't happen. Or people, so to speak, trying to do things together, and it just doesn't happen. So the myth that's being broken there is the one around the fact that, well, there's just too many frameworks. Well, we don't have that problem here. So let's use the world's most accepted one, which hasn't been out there before, and line up your collaborations, your outcomes, and your purpose to that. So look, my main gift I wanted to leave here today was to A, show my enthusiasm for these global goals, B, to let you know that there are examples in Australia. I've shared just one for you of the Good Save example case study, who has been able to break through those 3 myths. It's not just about international, it's domestic as well. It's not necessarily the fact that, they're too big or too audacious, we can do them. And thirdly, that we don't have the framework, so let's adopt it from this point on. Thank you very much.